Hi everybody. Today we're going to talk a little bit about social life and the development of economic and political systems in the colonies. Most of this material comes from Chapter 4 in American Pageant, but by the end of the screencast we may start to get into some of the material from 5 as well. So let's start with the southern colonies, and we're going to take a look at the way that social class structure is set up there. What you'll notice is that at the very, very top of southern society are going to be the rich planters. And these are the planters that are the stereotypical plantation owners within the South, the ones that you think about when you think about cotton and slavery in the 1800s. This is the very beginning of that process. These are the people who are wealthy enough to own hundreds of acres of land and perhaps have 50 to 100 or more slaves working the land for them. So they're a very, very small, wealthy elite. We also talk about the first families of Virginia being part of this planter class, and these would be the Washingtons and the Lees, the kinds of people who everything seems to be named after around here. And these rich planters had enormous influence on the House of Burgesses. Remember that the House of Burgesses is modeled after the British Parliament, and the British Parliament has a House of Lords and a House of Commons. Well, these rich planters would be like the House of Lords. They would be like the nobility of the colonies. Beneath the rich planters, you had poor farmers, and these were the majority of the farmers that you would find in southern society. They only had maybe the 50-acre plot of land that they got after they got out of their indentured servitude. Maybe they were able to expand that to 70 or 80 or 100 acres of land, but they didn't own a lot of land. And maybe if they were lucky, they had enough money to afford 1 to 2 possible slaves to work that land. But they were mainly working the land themselves, or members of their family were working the land with them. Beneath them, you had the landless whites. And these were most often people who got out of indentured servitude, but didn't own their own land, and then worked on the land of either the poor farmers or the rich planters. Beneath them, you had indentured servants. These would be white Europeans who were still in contract to labor for one of the wealthy planters. And then, of course, at the very bottom, you had African slaves. Plantation life really varied depending on which plantation you were on. Usually you had different types of attitudes towards the slaves. Some plantation owners were very benevolent. They cared for the slaves as though they were their children. They had a very paternalistic view of how they would take care of them. But basically plantation life was not the greatest for most slaves. First of all, many of the plantations were in inhospitable climates. Think of the hottest, most humid day of the summer, but then think of that with all kinds of diseases and no modern medicine to treat those diseases, mosquitoes, malaria, all the nasty stuff. But even the white people, even the wealthier white people in the South, did not have access to many quality comforts of life like we'd have today. And so the men had very short lifespans, leaving their widows behind often to care for the slaves and to take care of the plantations. So in the South, women actually were able to inherit property, which is something we're going to see not happen in the North. And many women grew wealthy inheriting the property and the wealth of their husbands who died usually much sooner than they did. The thing about the way that the South was set up is that it was very rural. Rural meaning country. Rural meaning not developed with modern city structures. And the few small cities that were there were kind of disconnected from one another and spread apart. So the setup of a southern colonial town was not the way that we're going to see the New England towns develop. You're going to see these plantations are large and disconnected from one another, and houses are very far apart from one another, so your nearest neighbor may be 20 or 30 miles away. There is a small urban professional class. These are going to be your lawyers, your doctors, your scholars, people who are educated, but again, very few people have the wealth or the time to be educated during this period. The main source of transportation in the South are going to be the powerful rivers and bays, things like the Chesapeake Bay, the James River, the Potomac River. These are all going to be extremely important in terms of transportation. And what we see in the South is that because most of the settlers who came to the South did not come for religious reasons, the church is not going to be centrally important to daily life in the South. It's not that there are no churches, and it's not that people aren't religious whatsoever, but it's more about the economy. It's more about agriculture in the South. And so education is not going to be valued in the same way. And because people are not as religious, people don't have to be as literate and don't have to read the Bible as much. So there is definitely less of a need for education, at least formal education. Let's compare this now to what life would be like in the colonies of New England, because there's going to be a pretty stark contrast here. First of all, because of the climate and the temperature and the clean water that they have in the north, you're going to see less of an impact of disease. So health is actually going to be much better in the north than you're going to see in the south. You've got a life expectancy of 70 years on average, which is really, really high for that time period. Because the settlers coming to the New England colonies tended to come over with their families, they settled as family units, we also saw that many of those families were much larger on average than they were in the South. Remember that many of the original settlers in the South were indentured servants who came over without any families. The family unit was really important to life in the colonies. As the head of the family, the husband was the spokesperson for the family and also tended to be the only member who was allowed to vote. Extended family is also really important too, and so we see the names of families settling these New England towns become very important, and those names end up carrying on traditions in towns. I know, for example, the Hubbard family was a really, really important family in the town I grew up in Connecticut, and that town was founded in the 1690s, and there are many things in town still named after the Hubbards. Married women did not have property rights in New England. The idea was that, again, the husband was the head of the family and he controlled all of the property and made all of the important decisions. Even when married women lost their husbands, when they became widows, they didn't inherit the land or the property directly. The property went into the control of the church, who would redistribute it as they saw fit. We already talked a little bit about the fact that these people settling in the New England colonies tended to be Calvinists, and so they believed in predestination and the idea that you had to work hard and make use of your skills, that anything less than that would be disrespectful to God. And so because the towns were structured in a much smaller, more closer knit fashion with houses closer together, and you'll see on the map in a second what I mean by that, people knew each other. There was more of a sense of community in the New England colonies than in the southern colonies because people lived more close together and people interacted with each other in church services. The image that you see on the right of this slide is an example of a congregational meeting house. This happened to be one from North Haven, Connecticut. But the congregational church became a very important center of the community in New England, and the meeting house had a dual purpose. The meeting house was where you would go to have your church service on Sunday, but it's also where you would go for town meetings, to discuss political matters, to vote on issues of taxation, to vote on issues of how the town was going to use its money and what big decisions might be made. And so when you went to church, sometimes it was unclear whether you were there for a political meeting or for a religious purpose, and there was a lot of intermixing between religion and politics in New England. Every town had some sort of a village or town green where they could meet for public events, and many New England towns still have this today, and you can go to them and see them. I know that Vienna has a town green, but that's pretty uncommon for this area of Virginia. And Vienna being one of the small towns in the center of Fairfax County, you don't see a lot of towns with a central town green, but Vienna's one of them, Herndon's another one. It's much more common in New England than it is in the South, though. New England was so big on education that many of the towns actually had public schools, and so there was a public education for any town that had more than 50 families, and these were places where kids would get educated in reading and writing and basic math, but mostly training them to become future leaders of the church and political leaders. And then obviously some of the most well-known and prestigious universities, although Virginia is unique in terms of the South, in terms of having some of the first universities, University of Virginia, William and Mary. The first of the Ivy League universities is created in Boston, Harvard. It's actually Cambridge, Massachusetts, in 1636, and it was developed as a theological school to train future preachers. So here's a map of the New England town. And what you notice in looking at this graphic is that the village green and the town hall and the church are all in the center. And then all of the houses are very close around the village green and around the town hall and church. And each one of those places where you see a little image of a house would be an individual plot of land owned by a family. So you see they're not big plots of land. These might be an acre or two at most. And so most of you who live here in Vienna, you probably live on a quarter of an acre or a third of an acre lot. The lots are not very big here. So theirs would have been slightly bigger, but the houses are very close together. And then you notice around the periphery of the town is where you have all of their farmland, all of where they plant their agriculture. And then they have a cow pasture and an ox pasture and then some swamp and woodlands. But these were communal. They would share the cow pastures and the ox pastures. And often they would share some of the farmland as well. So their house was on an individual plot that they owned, but the village, the town worked together to do their farming and to raise their livestock. All right, I'm going to pause it here for a second. What I want you to do is to go and watch the video of the Salem witch trials that I posted on Blackboard. There's a link there. You're going to watch that video, and then after the break, I will come back and explain to you a bit of what was going on with the Salem witch trials. Okay, hopefully you enjoyed that video, and it gave you a little bit of insight into the Salem witch trials. You know, I'm reminded as I watch that video that really the Salem witch trials is kind of like the earliest version of Mean Girls. There's a lot of it that has to do with social cliques and people spreading rumors and even a little bit of maybe what we would call today bullying going on. And it got out of control pretty quickly, and most of these cases were totally unfounded, based on rumors and based on social behaviors, that the same sorts of things that we see going on in a high school every day. One of the other challenges, besides the witch hunts that are going on in New England, is dealing with Native Americans. This is going to be an issue that keeps coming back. And so one of the things that some of the Puritans try to do in New England is to create what are called praying towns. And these are places where they're going to segregate and try to force assimilation on Indians, similar to the mission system that the Spanish were implementing in modern-day Mexico and Central and South America. But the idea is that you create a plot of land far enough away for comfort, but near enough that you can keep an eye on things. And you send your preachers there and you send your religious authorities there to try to teach Indians the ways of the Bible, to teach them Christian values, to convert them to Christianity. And so this is actually the precursor to what will become the modern Indian reservation system. We'll learn about that later in the year. The other problem that the Puritans were having in New England was that the kids being born in the colonies were not as religious as their parents. So second and third generation Puritans, they were not interested in this process of conversion. Conversion is this idea that you have to have this major spiritual event in your life where you connect to God. And you have to admit to it publicly and explain it in a very public way to let people know that you've proven that God has chosen you. And so you actually have to get up in front of the church and basically reveal everything about yourself. You need to be humble and then beg for forgiveness for your sins. And this can be a really humiliating experience for a lot of people. And so kids are not into that. They kind of don't care so much, and they even have the audacity to say to their parents, well, maybe I don't want to be a member of the church. But the problem is that they can't vote unless they're a member of the church. And the colony is afraid that the future generation of the colony will not have enough people to vote and keep the colony running. So what do? They cough. Just kidding. No, they don't cough. They come up with a compromise called the halfway covenant, where this says you can still be a part of the church without going through the whole conversion process. And we're going to allow you to vote, but basically we're going to relax the regulations about conversion. And they're hoping that this will keep people interested in the church and give them that next generation of voters. It's not really all that successful, but what we end up starting to see is that the younger generations of the settlers in the colonies, the second, third, fourth generation, are going to start shifting their attitudes about what is important in life and what role religion should play. And a lot of them are going to start to have more of an entrepreneurial focus, making money, being successful, but not so much being holy and being driven by morality. So we're going to stop there for now and pick up in the next screencast with material from Chapter 5.